Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to mention a few things I forgot to talk about in my review of the last episode of Season 3 of Discovery, as well as expand upon some of the problems. And also looking back at the whole season, there were a lot of things which were seemingly set up, but didn't really go anywhere. There were all these mystery boxes about the burn, and at least that was resolved by the end of the season, even though, a lot of people don't like the idea. I actually don't really hate the basic idea of that, Kelpian child who got mutated and was linked to the dilithium. I could be fine with that because we did have similar stuff in the older Star Trek shows, which I loved. We did have similar ideas of all kinds of nearly omnipotent beings who did bad things maybe by accident, like in the TNG episode The Survivors, which had that immortal, very powerful being who accidentally killed the whole species of 50 billion people because he was angry about some of them killing his wife, and so in a moment of rage he wiped all of them out and then immediately regretted it and he's ashamed of it. So maybe the show should have condemned that character kind of more strongly, but also we can kind of understand that it was kind of a split second decision in a moment of rage, so it could have happened to anyone and therefore you can kind of forgive it and all of that. And there was no way to imprison him or to hold him, and so Picard just left him. So I thought that was a good episode of TNG. So that's just one example of a similarity of the same kind of crazy ideas of people with insane powers and all kinds of psychic, godlike powers, and so that's nothing new to the Star Trek franchise. That's why I can kind of forgive that, even though I think it's ultimately disappointing when you look at the whole series and this season, because it could have been much more interesting. They could have introduced some brand new enemy or some really powerful beings who are evil, and then you would have to deal with them, and then they would be an intimidating villain, unlike the one we got of that green lady, who was not any real threat and was not really interesting. So I thought it's a missed opportunity because they could have introduced something much bigger, much more powerful, and maybe even say that whoever caused the burn maybe did it for a good reason. Maybe that being wanted to stop all the wars in the galaxy, planets invading each other, attacking each other, or interfering in each other's business. So maybe the one who did it actually thought he's doing it for a good reason, to stop all of that, to save even more lives than were lost. So that could have been an interesting kind of morality dilemma to introduce, and yet they went with something which was basically an accident. So someone accidentally caused all of this. I think ultimately it's less interesting. Even though as its own story, I don't think it's really that bad, because we did have similar stories. There was the episode Future Imperfect, about that alien who lived his whole life in the holodeck, and we don't know how old he is. He pretended to be a child, but that was because his final form was small, so maybe he was an adult, maybe he was an old alien. We don't really know how long he was there, and so that's an interesting kind of a science fiction idea. And also there was the episode The Bonding, about the kid who lost his mother and wanted to stay in the holodeck and to live with his mother in the holodeck as not to face the reality that she died and all of that. So we had a lot of similar elements in the older shows, and I could complain about the fact they're recycling the same ideas, but the ideas themselves were not that bad. So that's why I don't really hate the whole part with the Kelpian, even though it's ultimately disappointing when you look at the whole season. So that's all, that's the entire mystery box solution. And also there were a bunch of things they totally forgot to explain, such as the fact that everyone in the galaxy knew a specific music, which I guess all of them heard at the same time as the burner. So I thought they're going to explain that by also using the Kelpian, that he maybe sang that song and it kind of resonated with the Elysium planet and got transmitted everywhere or something, but it was never addressed. So they never actually solved the very mystery that they introduced themselves. And so what the hell is that? What kind of writing is that, when they set up all kinds of things and then never fulfill them or do a cop-out in the end? And the same thing with Michael's mother being a space ninja and all of that. By the way, I made a mistake in my previous review when I called her Jat Vash, when it's actually Kuat Milan or something like that. I still don't remember it. In Picard it was confusing because there were so many different all-female sects of only females who do something, and so we had a bunch of them, so that's why I confused all of that. So anyway, they introduced her as that space ninja, so I thought, okay, at some point she's going to cut people's heads off, and they didn't even do that. So what was the point to make her a ninja if you're not even going to show her do anything? And the thing with the robots, which didn't really do anything in the end, they set them up, they were setting it up the whole season, the whole thing about the sphere data, and then it didn't go anywhere, it didn't really do anything. And how come in this future of the 32nd century, why is it so rare and special to have a sentient computer? Shouldn't they be everywhere in this time period? Sentient holograms, androids, ship's computers should technically all be sentient in this time, and instead they all are less advanced than even what we saw in this show previously in the 23rd century. Even the control AI was smarter than the holograms we see now in this future, so how can we explain that? So it doesn't really make sense unless it's deliberate restrictions, and if they mention that, then I would be okay with that. If they simply said, oh, at a certain time, the androids rebelled again a second time and tried to summon those robot tentacles from another galaxy, so we had to limit all AI in the future, and so they could have explained all of that, and yet they didn't. And so why is the sphere data so powerful that Osira cannot shut it down if it's supposed to be so common in the future, as we saw in all the other shows? Whenever they showed us glimpses of the future, it's supposed to be much more advanced. And where is the mobile emitter, which I think was said to be 29th century technology, which the Doctor and Voyager got and then used, and so he was totally a free hologram. So that was an even older technology than this current season, and so why is Grey worried about people not seeing her? If they can do it, they can give her a mobile emitter, and technically, the entire ship should be a holodeck on every ship, because again, back in the 23rd century, every room had its own holodeck in this show. So in the 32nd century, there should be free holograms everywhere. So why is Grey worried that they will not be able to make her a hologram when they go back to the Discovery, and how come no one thought about it before? And it only happens on this much older ship, because they're now on a ship which is 125 years at least, and it has all this technology which makes it possible, and yet they cannot do it on Discovery, so it makes no sense. So why not give her a mobile emitter? So that's why this show doesn't fit the other shows and doesn't even fit its own internal logic, because we saw more advanced holograms back in the 23rd century when Control could fool anyone into thinking it's a real person, and yet in this far future everyone are always able to tell who is a hologram, and they can defeat them by blinking really fast and stupid stuff like that. So let's just analyze it logically. So back in the 23rd century, AI holograms were able to pretend to be real people and no one could tell. And yet, 1,000 years later, when technology should be far more advanced, suddenly everyone is able to tell who is a hologram, and all the holograms are glitchy always, and you can defeat them by blinking really fast and stuff like that. And so it makes no sense even inside of this show without thinking about the other shows. And if it's set in the same timeline as Voyager, for example, then we should be seeing free holograms as individuals walking around with mobile emitters. And technically the Doctor from Voyager should still be alive, so that could have been a nice cameo to actually show him as a character in Starfleet or something like that. And they could have even said that he has some kind of unique piece of technology that others don't have and stuff like that. They could have said that they limited the AI in other holograms, but because he was a special case before that law came into effect, that's why he was allowed to stay alive. They didn't want to execute him, obviously, so they could have come up with an excuse for why he's a unique character and not just everyone being holograms, which would be a little bit silly. It would negate the need for humans. I said the same thing about androids. I talked about that in many videos, and I said I'm fine with the idea of limiting the AI. Otherwise, who needs the humans? We can have a show just about androids and holograms doing everything. And so, because we do want to keep human characters in the show, I would be fine with putting a limitation on AI in the future, and that way we can have kind of a more advanced technology, but without being overpowered at the same time. So they could have done that with the hologram, simply explain it in the dialogue. So of course they didn't. And seeing Voyager's Doctor, for example, that could have made sense. That would be fine because he is not supposed to be aging. We could have seen Robert Picardo as he looks like now, and it would be fine because we can assume he can program himself to age, and yet he can still be alive in the future because he doesn't really age, and so that would be fine. So that was a missed opportunity not to have a cameo like that. And speaking of missed opportunities, there was also something in the end of this episode which at first viewing I thought it's a clever reference to Deep Space Nine, when Tilly said something about going to some distant starbase which had a signature gelato, and I kind of misheard it when I first saw this episode, and I thought they were talking about those Jamja sticks from Deep Space Nine, which was a Bajoran confection made from some Bajoran tree or something like that. So when they said some starbase had a signature gelato, I misheard it as a Jamanja stick, and so I thought, oh, that's a clever reference to Deep Space Nine without saying it by name. So it's a clever reference to Deep Space Nine without saying the name specifically, which would be kind of too much on the nose. Instead, it's for the hardcore fans who would notice and recognize what they are talking about and realize it's about Deep Space Nine. So I thought I was about to praise them. That's actually a clever reference. But then I realized that they didn't say Jamajja, they said Gelato, which is can be anywhere, so it's not a reference to Deep Space Nine. So this is an example of a missed opportunity. And if they had someone in the production who's actually a Star Trek fan, or someone who worked on the old shows, then they'd be getting all this stuff much more correctly. They could have hired someone, like me, and I would even do it for free, like just take me as an advisor, and I would have checked their scripts, and I would have inserted all these little details, and I would have corrected all the things that they did wrong, which annoys so many people, not just Star Trek fans, but even fans of just common sense, because the stuff they show us in the show often lacks even that, even basic common sense, such as the fact that we can see the size of the ship from the outside, we can see how many windows there are, we can kind of guess how many floors there are on the ship, and yet when they show us that giant turbolift shaft, which is looks like a size of a city, and they have an action scene inside there which goes on forever, so it makes it look like it's an infinite empty space inside the ship, that is ridiculous even to people who just enjoy common logic and common sense. It doesn't make sense to them and it drives them nuts. And I've discussed this whole issue before, and I said I don't actually mind it visually. I like to see giant structures in space and that kind of stuff. That's why I really enjoyed seeing the interior of the Borg ship in TNG, for example. But it has to fit what we see from the outside, otherwise it makes it stupid. And so if you want to show stuff like that inside the ship, then establish that the ship is much bigger, and then that will be totally fine. And yet they don't do that, and that is stupid. And the sad thing is that in this episode they had an easy solution to have that kind of action scene and make it make sense by simply setting it on Osira's huge ship, which they did show us from the outside that it is much bigger than Discovery, so all they had to do is simply set that action scene on her ship. And then it would be totally fine, and they could have had it just a small change in the script that Michael has to go to Osira's ship in order to try to free the Discovery or to kill Osira or something like that, and just set that specific action scene on her ship, and then it would be totally fine. And yet they didn't. And another clever way they could have done it is by tying it to an old episode of Star Trek Enterprise in which they once encountered a small ship which they said was from the 31st century, and when they opened that ship they could see that inside the ship it's much bigger on the inside than the outside. And they also said the alloy was made from some metals which were liquid, and it has all kinds of organic circuitry, and so obviously they were trying really hard to make that future ship seem much more advanced. And one of those ways was to say that inside it's much bigger because presumably it has some kind of a spatial bending technology, and it can kind of compact more space inside a smaller space or something like that. And all of that is an interesting science fiction idea. So that was from the 31st century, and this show is now in the 32nd century, so they should have the same kind of technology, which obviously they don't. But if they did, it would make it interesting, and it would explain that kind of scene. And so all they had to do was establish it previously in this season, that the Starfleet ships of the future can be smaller on the outside and bigger on the inside, because they have this kind of a spatial compression technology or something like that, just like in Deep Space Nine they once encountered the subspace anomaly which can shrink ships. And so if that kind of thing is possible, then technically maybe you can create some kind of room inside the ship which could contain much more space, like people would shrink when they go in there, or it's all in some kind of pocket dimension or something. So they could have set it up, and then they could have this kind of action scene by revealing the Discovery has this chamber inside it which has so much space inside it, and maybe they use it for some purpose, maybe to store all the dilithium that they want to bring from that planet or something. So maybe they prepare that chamber for such a purpose as a huge storage room or something. Of course, it would still beg the question, why was it there back in season 2? We saw the same kind of roller coaster turbolifts also in a giant space, but it wasn't as bad then. It was still ridiculous, it still didn't fit the ship, but it wasn't as gigantic as we now see it, and so now it's even worse than before. So the makers of the show obviously don't even listen to criticism of their show, they don't try to fix their own mistake, they just double down, they make it even stupider now, but at least now it's set in the far future, so if they wanted to, they could have easily explained it with some technobabble saying that yeah, they have a pocket dimension set up to make the Discovery a bigger ship on the inside, and to have that kind of empty space inside of it. Fine, I could have forgiven that, especially since it was set up back in Enterprise that this kind of technology would exist by the 31st century, and this is even after that. So that could have been fine, and that could have even been an interesting science fiction idea. So of course they didn't do any of that, there is no explanation, that's just their turbo shaft which looks like a giant city somewhere inside the ship, which makes no sense. And I even thought about coming up with an excuse and saying maybe Discovery had that kind of super duper secret technology that no other ships had, and maybe it's all because of the spore drive that they had to set up some kind of pocket dimension around the spore chamber or something so that it will make it all possible. So I even thought about doing that, but we saw the same kind of stuff in one of the short treks set in the Enterprise with Pike and all of that. So we saw the same stuff in that short trek when Spock is stuck with number one in a turbo lift and they have to get out, and then they again show us that giant empty space which looks exactly the same. And so it's not something unique to Discovery. And I could have also forgiven it if they didn't have all those space shots showing us the size of the ship exactly, meaning if we only ever saw the windows, then maybe I could say that maybe not every level has a window, and maybe the windows on the outside look bigger than they are on the inside for some reason, and so maybe the ship is actually that big. But they had establishing shots in which they show us the ship from space and the camera is zooming in until it reaches a window and goes inside and then shows the people. So all those shots showed us exactly the size of the ship, so it cannot possibly be as big as they show us on the inside. And to make all of this even more ridiculous, they established early in this season that they only have about 80 crew members on the ship, the ones who agreed to go after Michael to the future, and yet every time we see someone walking through a corridor, the corridor is full packed of people who work in the corridor. And so I made fun of that before, and I said, wait a second, is the entire crew all in one corridor all the time? Because that's how it makes it look. I would be fine with that if they didn't say how many people there are on the ship, and we can simply assume there are so many people that every single corridor has so many people in them. But no, they specifically said they have only 80 people on the ship, and of course we saw a lot more of them. If we look at all the extras we saw across the season, they had much more than 80, I think. And maybe they got extra crew when they joined back with Starfleet, even though I don't know who would want to serve on this ship with these people. But anyway, we can assume they got new crew members, but still it makes it ridiculous if the ship is this big as now we see from the inside, and how come every time someone walks in a corridor there are dozens of people in the same corridor. So all of this kind of stuff shows me that they are not paying attention to details which are common sense. It doesn't have to do with the rest of the Star Trek franchise. It has to do with just basic common sense and internal logic, and they don't even have that. And that kind of stuff just takes me out of it. I cannot get invested into this show when constantly something stupid happens, which brings me out of it. It just makes me scratch my head every single minute something illogical happens, and that's one of the biggest problems in this show in my opinion. And another funny thing that happened in the last episode was when Michael suddenly met that Indian guy from the first episode. His name is Sahil, I think, or something like that. The guy who was waiting for 40 years for someone to come, living alone on a starbase because he had no contact with the rest of the Federation. And apparently Michael never bothered to pick him up. Like, he's the guy who helped her find Discovery. He helped her send a signal or to locate Discovery when it arrived. And then she went with Book to the Discovery, and yet she left that guy alone on that station. And even after she got back to the Discovery and now had access to the spore jump, it would have been a matter of 2 minutes to spore jump to his location and to pick him up so that he wouldn't have to be alone in some distant sector of the galaxy. And apparently she never bothered to do that, or even to talk with him and ask him if he wants to go with them or something. So she never bothered to do that. She just left him alone, and somehow he found his way back to Starfleet by himself. And we know that because of the fact that she's surprised to see him in Starfleet headquarters. It's obviously the first time she sees him again. We can know it by the dialogue, the way that he tells her, oh, you find your way to Starfleet, and she tells him, oh, you also found your way. So that means she never bothered to even contact him and to ask him how you're doing, if you want maybe for us to give you a lift or something. So she never even bothered to contact him in all this time. So that makes it laughable, that makes it ridiculous kind of character-wise. And also it's a common sense problem. It's not something, it doesn't have to do with the rest of the Star Trek franchise or something like that. It's just inside of this own show, it makes no sense logically. You know that guy was alone for 40 years on a space station, and he wants to be part of the Federation, he said so, and you have a spore jump, so it would be no trouble at all for you to go and pick him up, and you don't even offer him to do it, and you just leave him there, and then months later when he finds his way somehow by himself, and then you're surprised to see him. So that's just laughable to me. It makes this show kind of unintentional comedy. Stuff like that is just funny by how stupid it is. So at least maybe we can salvage some kind of entertainment value out of all of this stupidity by turning it into funny reviews, parodies, mashup edits and that kind of stuff, and that's what I will be doing in the near future. So I will be making more videos both on this channel and on my other channel, on which I'm showing the clips and showing compilations and mashups and comparison videos and stuff like that. So all of that I think is fun. So let me know what you think, and we can discuss it in the comment section below. Check out all the links in the description. Please hit the like button, click the notification bell if you want to see updates of new videos, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.